another world, another time, in the age of wonder.
You are listening to The Dark Crystal Minute.
And begin, all the same. Sometimes good, sometimes bad.
And now once more the world must undergo a time of testing.
It is time to return to the castle.
There is much to be learned, and you have no time.
And here's your hosts, Philip Mitchell and JM Prater. Hello and welcome to the Dark Crystal Minute. This is your Dark Crystal podcast breaking down the film 1 minute at a time. I'm your host, Philip Mitchell, and with me, as always, is my co-host, JM Prater.
Great to be here again.
As always, yeah. And, as we're continuing discussing about the film, The Dark Crystal, in anticipation for The Dark Crystal Age of Resistance. And in this episode, we are up to minute 23. So we are watching between minutes 22 to 23 of The Dark Crystal. And pretty much just to break it down, just what happens in this minute, which basically we see Jen, he's continue his trek, climbing up the big mountains and stuff to try and reach Aughra's observatory, or the Aughra's high hill. And again, it's so cool, just seeing all these little creatures, with these pink, these pink plant monsters, and then later on you see these crystal crabs sort of, running around, and yeah, it's such a fun little moment with that, yeah.
It is, and again, it's like an underwater world brought to the surface, where they look like sea anemone, like those crabs you would see underwater, like shrimp, but it's all an exterior. What's interesting, I think, about this scene, about this minute, is the creatures seem very afraid of Jen, and I think because it's the world that they live in, whereas I don't think they would be initially. Everyone's kind of afraid. They kind of get spooked, and Jen makes a sound, and they all kind of crawl back to where they came from.
And I guess the fact that these creatures haven't seen a gelfling for a very long time, so maybe they're just like, what's going on? Is this a gelfling? And
totally,
and all that. So, and as we sort of get a bit of Jen's monologue, very funny moments where it's seeing these creatures like, what in the world, and this place is weird, and and he's still trying to work out what's going on, and following the message from his master, follow the greatest sun for a day to the home of Aughra, some directions, and he's trying to think, who's this Aughra? Is Aughra one of those sea crab creatures, or does she murder gelflings? So it's just him just sort of journeying, of course, and it pretty much ends that he sort of ends up getting caught in the vines and trapped, sort of like a net of sorts, and sort of as the tension sort of builds up with the music, and that is pretty much what this minute is all about. And
what I think is interesting about this minute as well is it really showcases he's lived a very sheltered life. He's like, what is this? Where am I? Mm-hmm. He's only really lived between the forest that he swims in and plays his flute, and the Mystic Valley. He's not explored the world. They've kept him so close to protect him that he seems very lost in the world. He doesn't really know what he's doing, and he was like, yes, I'll do this, but he doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know where he's going. He doesn't know who he's meeting. So he's this sort of begrudging hero. He's on this quest, but he doesn't really understand if it's a quest. He doesn't really know what he's supposed to do, and now in this last part of the minute, he gets trapped.
He does, yeah. And actually, it just made me think of, those similarities, like with the Dark Crystal and Star Wars, where, we had the Mystic who passed away very similarly than what, Yoda disappearing sort of thing. And in this case, it's like with Jen being trapped in the nets, it's sort of, what happens to the heroes in Star Wars with Luke and Han and, with the Ewoks, they all get stuck up in the nets and stuff. So that was just another little funny sort of parallel, with Return of the Jedi and the Dark Crystal. Both of them were pretty much filmed pretty close to each other. But yeah, it's just sort of, it was just a cool little minute of him just, continuing his journey, and yeah, I guess, he'll definitely find out what's going to happen next as he, tries to find this Aughra character.
One thing to note, I think, again, in terms of puppetry, you go from a wide shot. One of those shots looks like it's maybe somebody in Jen's suit, like what's the guy who's in the Jen suit. So he's turning, and then it cuts to a puppet.
Oh yes, yeah, now I just remembered, yeah, because I think you discovered it very early on. I think when we first sort of caught up, and you're like, oh my god, there's Jim Henson's head in one of the shots.
Which is funny that they didn't catch it maybe they did catch it. I'm sure they probably did, but they're like, well, what are we gonna do?
Yeah, I mean, of course, yeah, and I mean, like, it was all shot on film. Yeah, I think they were pretty limited with the options. I mean, of course, they had video monitors pretty much the whole time. That probably that Frank Oz, like in that moment, I mean, Frank Oz would have been directing the scene, and Jim performing as Jen. And of course, I mean, there was one of the things behind the scenes where with Frank Oz, he seemed to like to do a lot of takes with scenes and moments, but Jim is usually, with directing, he's sort of like, we get a couple of takes, and if it's good, then we just move on. But Frank Oz, he was such a perfectionist, in his way of directing, trying to do a lot of takes, and maybe this was one of those moments where he only had a couple of takes to do it and didn't realize it, or they probably did realize it, but it's like, whatever, just had to move along with the shoot.
There's a moment, that last moment, few moments of the minute, where Jen is taken up into the whatever those are, the vines, those moving vines. It's cutting to another puppet that they had to kind of figure out how they're going to. So the puppet's moving up, but his ears are also, like, Jen's ears are responding, like he's afraid. I don't know if you've noticed this before, but Jen's ears move when he's frightened. Yeah, like if we rewind the clip, or if you guys listening or watching, rewind the clip, you'll see Jen's ears move a little bit. It's very interesting. So all of these things are going on when he's being taken up into the vines, and you have puppeteers doing all of those things, and I think it's just amazing. Again,
yeah, and just the amount of detail, like, even the choreograph, just having those subtle little moments or movements with, like with the Gelfling's ears and all that kind of stuff. So that is so awesome. So now I want to watch that minute again, all these things that we always discover. So I hope you've been enjoying listening to these minutes as we've sort of been breaking them down as always. And yeah, I think they'll probably wrap up for this episode of the Dark Crystal Minute. If you'd like to get in contact with the show, you can do so at darkcrystalpodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/darkcrystalpodcast. You can check us out on Twitter at darkcrystalpod. We're also on Instagram at darkcrystalpodcast. And if you can give us a review on Facebook or on iTunes, that'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for your time, and come back next time for more The Dark Crystal Minute.